We are in the 5th week of a series on the book of John, but fear not. Don't worry, you haven't entered into something that you're like, I'm going to have to catch up. Hopefully every week should feel a bit contained. But I'm loving this series quite selfishly, but partly because we keep on going through stories that are very familiar. Like you might have read them in Sunday school, you might remember them from RE lessons, and then actually what we're seeing is we're pulling out some stuff that, I think in today it can feel like so often the Bible's so far removed from our everyday experience here in Liverpool in 2023, and yet so many times these stories have such relevance and help us to work out who Jesus actually is. And the series is called Love Has a Name for a reason. The book of John is all about love. Love is the overarching theme, but John isn't saying love is something that Clinton cards can tell you in a card, or it's not something that Michael Bublé can sing to you, or it's not something that Jamie Oliver can whip up a meal to give you. He's saying that actually love is personified in the person of Jesus Christ. And the book of John is a reflection or a meditation on that person who is Jesus. So we're on chapter 5, and I'm going to dive straight in. So if you've got a Bible, or if not, it'll come up on the screen. It goes like this. Sometime later, Jesus went up to Jerusalem for one of the Jewish festivals. Now there is in Jerusalem near the sheep gate a pool which in Aramaic is called Bethesda, which is surrounded by 5 colored colonnades. Here a great number of disabled people used to lie, the blind, the lame, the paralyzed. One who was there had been an invalid for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and learned that he had been in this condition for a long time, he asked him, "Do you want to get well?" "Sir," the invalid replied, "I have no one to help me into the pool when the water is stirred. While I'm trying to get in, someone else goes down ahead of me." Then Jesus said to him, "Get up, pick up your mat and walk." And at once the man was cured. He picked up his mat and walked. The day on which this took place was the Sabbath, and so the Jewish leaders said to the man who had been healed, "It is the Sabbath. The law forbids you to carry your mat." But he replied, "The man who made me well said to me, 'Pick up your mat and walk.'" So they asked him, "Who is this fellow who you told to pick up and walk?" The man who was healed had no idea who it was, for Jesus had slipped away into the crowd that was there. Later, Jesus found him at the temple and said to him, "See, you are well again. Stop sinning or something worse may happen to you." The man went away and told the Jewish leaders that it was Jesus who had made him well. We'll continue in a minute, because we need to pause. It's an odd story with strange parts all over it. And it's almost like one of my daughters when they get home from school and they want to tell me everything about their day, and it goes a bit like this, like we had lunch, then I ate my friend's banana, then we played in the sand, we pushed Lego up each other's noses, then a teacher tried to do a backflip off a slide, and then we sung Baby Shark, and then we pretended we were all in prison, and you're a poo. And then you're like, whoa, just slow down a minute. What's actually going on? And the thing is a lot of Bible passages are written in a certain way to elicit certain emotions, to drive something out of us as the reader, to catch our attention about some things. And I think so often we read it a bit like a textbook given to us in RE, and we just kind of read it and think, oh yeah, cool, and we just keep reading, hopefully remember some stuff. But the Bible writers are trying to capture our attention. They're trying to rise an emotion out of us. And so we need to take a moment. Where are we? If you were here in week 1, we looked at the overarching narrative of the entire Gospel of John. John 1 starts an intro, John 2 starts the wedding at Cana where Jesus turns water into wine, and then he turns tables over in the temple, and then in chapter 3 he meets Nicodemus at the dead of night, and they talk about how to be born again, and then in chapter 4 he meets a Samaritan woman at a well and kind of crosses over racial and political boundaries, and now we find ourselves in chapter 5 confronting the tradition of the Sabbath. But also, whenever John talks about Jerusalem, as he does in verse 1 of chapter 5, we now know that Jesus is walking towards the religious elite. Those for whom were educated in the ways of the Torah, those who would be worshippers at the main synagogue in the middle of Jerusalem. Now, throughout John's gospel, we have Jesus flip-flopping between Galilee and Jerusalem, then Galilee, then Jerusalem. And Galilee is like where ordinary folk, probably where most of us would have lived. And then Jerusalem, we're meant to be thinking, okay, Jesus is on a mission here to confront something very religious. But also we're told a couple of other things. We're told that he's going towards Jerusalem at the time of a festival. And a festival means all kinds of things. One, it means that pilgrims would be coming from all over the land to come to Jerusalem to worship. Which means that Jesus' audience was a mixture of Jewish teachers, Pharisees, scribes, teachers of the law, as well as pilgrims from all over different parts of the Jewish world, some from Greece, some from Asia, all over, who are coming to Jerusalem to worship. And then we're told that Jesus is at a pool surrounded by colonnades, a pool called Bethesda, which literally means house of mercy. And here's a literal picture of it in Jerusalem. It's the only one of its kind in Jerusalem, and it's dated back to 2,000 years ago. And it was a pool, which it wasn't like Garston baths. We're talking what this was a pool where people who were infirm in any kinds of way, disabled in any kinds of way, or had some kind of illness would come, and there was a folklore wives' tale around the water that led people to believe that if they got into the water at a certain time, then they would be made well. And so who is there? Well, Jesus meets this guy who has been disabled for 38 years, hoping that they would get healed by the water. Now, if anyone has a different translation of the Bibles, maybe you've got a King James, old school, traditional Bible, you'll notice that there is a verse in here that we didn't read out, which is verse 4. In most people's Bibles, it's a footnote. They cut it out. And what this is, it says the context of that wives' tale, there was this belief that an angel of the Lord would come down and stir up the waters, and that whoever got into the water first after that stirring would be healed. And now scholars debate as to whether that was some mineral that would flush into this water and then flush out, or whether it was like a kind of little tectonic earthquake that would rubber. It doesn't matter. What we're talking about is a guy who is at hope's end, clinging on to some hope that maybe one day he'd be healed. The guy's one hope is that he would be amongst the first to enter into this water to be healed. And now obviously the Bible was written many thousand years ago, and it's so far removed from my everyday experience, isn't it? None of us have probably ever hoped for something for so long that isn't actually coming to fruition. Probably none of us have felt hopeless at any time. Probably none of us have felt lonely and isolated because of hopelessness, have we? The thing is hopelessness comes in so many shapes and forms. It may be to do with your physical health, or your mental health, or your relational health, or your financial health, or your job security, but most of us probably at some point have felt hopeless. In fact, the stats tell us that we have, 1 in 6 adults suffer from a common mental health disorder that has found its root in some form of hopelessness. Men are twice as likely to suffer than women from that kind of thing. However, only 15% of women receive treatment for depression, and only 9% of men do. 61% of 16 to 24-year-olds in employment are experiencing symptoms of depression. The book of Proverbs says this, that hope deferred makes the heart sick, but a longing fulfilled is a tree of life. This guy was hopeless, completely hopeless, and just grasping at anything to get better. I don't know about you, but the times I felt most hopeless, I've also felt probably the most isolated in my life. In 2016, I had to go to court to give evidence as the primary witness in a historic sexual abuse case that resulted in the person getting sentenced to 9 years in prison. However, the 3 years leading up to that, 2 things were happening. I was in ministry, I was working for a church, and it was really great, and every now and then, I'd be phoned up by the police to kind of divulge another grim detail that was contributing towards the case, but it always happened without fail in the middle of a Bible study, or before I was getting up to preach, or one time when I was at a festival about to preach to thousands of people, and 5 seconds before, my phone went and I had to give some horrible, dark detail. And at the same time as that, I was also training for ordination in the Church of England. So I was going to college with all very lovely people who I assumed had it all together all the time. Surrounded by amazing leaders in God's church, studying some incredibly beautiful aspects of theology, writing essays which I was quite proud of, but still quietly behind the scenes, I was helping the police in this weird and quite extensive inquiry. I felt so alone, felt so dirty and hopeless and terrified. What if the person didn't get convicted? Have I just made it up? But at a church, I'd always keep a brave face, which I'm sure none of you have ever done that, right? You've never just pretended everything's okay. But there were 2 places where I felt known. The first was when I was at home. I felt totally known. I felt I could say whatever I wanted to my wife about everything that's going on. And the other place that I felt really known was in counseling. But apart from those 2 arenas, I felt so isolated and alone. And yet I was in a super healthy church, thriving theologically, and people were so kind, but sometimes your circumstance can just be so blinding that you can't lift your head to see the other stuff, right? And this guy at the pool, alone, hopeless, clinging on to this folkloric tale that maybe he would be healed if he only got into the water. And even when Jesus, the one from whom all things were created, God made flesh, the one whom the fullness of God dwells within, all healing in his wings, all blessing at his disposal, he rocks up to this guy and asks the $1 million question: do you want to get well? The thing is we often read that and just carry on and think, oh, Jesus is being a bit socially awkward and he just doesn't know how to ask a good question. It's meant to be an odd question, and it's meant to make us raise our eyebrows. Jesus, surely you know this guy wants to be well. Why wouldn't someone want to get well? Well, in the time of Jesus, the thing is this guy's disability gave him some assurances. It gave him some kind of income as a beggar at a time of festivals. As pilgrims come to worship, they often want to come and worship not only their goat in sacrifice, but also their wallet. And so on your way, you would try and give as many alms, give as much charitable giving as possible. And so if you're a beggar at the time of Jesus and at a time of festivals, you knew there was some kind of income coming. Even if it was minor, you knew there was some kind of money coming. Also, your future is very predictable. You know that this is kind of my day. My days are exactly the same day in, day out. You know your limitations. This mat is everything that I know, that as I sit on this mat every day, my limitations are secure. There is safety in that security. And also, if you're not getting well, your faith won't be tested. So I'm just staying here day in, day out. I don't need to test anything. The thing is, some people can't even imagine what life without that dark cloud over them would feel like. And we live in a nation clouded by anxiety and depression, ill health, both physically and mentally. And so many people are simply trapped by their imagination, not daring them to believe they could do something either. Growing up on a council estate, that was certainly where my mates are still currently living. All my friends from where I grew up have either stayed there, trapped by their circumstance, not daring to believe they could do anything other, still working in the same pubs or shops they grew up working in. And to be honest, it's why my wife and I share a Facebook profile, is because I find it so difficult sometimes to see where my family and my friends are from my upbringing. Do you want to get well? Do you want to get well? And then our friend on the mat responds, well, how could I possibly get well? How could I possibly get well if no one carries me to the pool? How often do we put our hope in something else and miss God's presence right there? We say things like, well, I'll get out of debt when I get that promotion. Or I'll get healthy next Lent when I can start a new diet. Or I'll just ask for help next time I really crash and burn. Or I'll join recovery when I meet someone who's struggling in the same way. Or I'll try and mend that relationship the next time I bump into that person. John Calvin, a theologian, puts it this way: the sick man does what we nearly all do. He limits God's help to his own ideas and does not dare promise himself more than he conceives in his mind. How many of us have just said, you know what? God's help is probably me at my best day. Like, that's God rocking up, is when I'm at my best day doing my best stuff. That we've limited God's help to our own ideas, and we don't ever dare promise ourselves more than we can ever conceive in our mind. The thing is, the answer to all of our mess, on mats both metaphorical and literal, all of our mess is here right now. God, by his presence, wants to heal us, by his Spirit, by his word, and by his power. And Jesus doesn't even entertain the guy's response. He simply says, get up, pick up your mat, and walk. Get up, something the guy couldn't possibly do alone. Pick your mat up, something that defines his entire circumstance, and walk, something that requires an exercise in faith. And then we're told that once the man was cured, he picked up his mat and walked. And then the trouble for Jesus begins. We'll carry on reading from verse 16. So because Jesus was doing these things on the Sabbath, the Jewish leaders began to persecute him. In his defense, Jesus said to them, my Father is always at his work to this very day, and I too am working. And for this reason, they tried all the more to kill him. Not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he was even calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God. And so what's the big deal here? What's going on? This is the first instance we have in John's Gospel of the Jewish authorities wanting to kill Jesus. Like, again, it's meant to be odd as we read it. They want to kill Jesus. Not like put him in prison, they want to kill him. Is that a rational response? So far, In Jesus' life, he's cleared a temple, saying he is like the new temple. He's had a chat with a rabbi and turned his teaching upon its head. He's spoken with a Samaritan woman, crossing over racial and political boundaries, and converted many other people in Samaria. He's also healed a Roman official's son, and now he's back in Jerusalem, and he's healed someone on the Sabbath. And this is what began the murderous intent towards Jesus. Well, why? Well, if you've been in church a little while, then you'll probably know that Sabbath in Jewish custom was a pretty big thing. Pretty huge thing. Even today in Orthodox Jewish communities, a huge thing. And I want us to get a little understanding of this to help us understand a bit more. So we're going to get a biblical teaching on that. That's kind of an overview. So we'll begin at 10 Commandments found in Exodus 20. The Sabbath commandment is number 4. It's also on our wall up there somewhere. It says this: remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord. In it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your manservant or your maidservant, or your cattle, or the sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. And so we need to remember 5 quick things. First, the Israelites are told to remember the rest day. Sabbath literally means he rested. Remember the Sabbath day means don't actually forget to take a day off. But we need to remember it's not just a day off either. Secondly, it says keep it holy, means set it aside from all other days as special. Specifically, as verse 10 says, keep it to the Lord or for the Lord. In other words, the rest is not meant to be aimless rest, but God-centered rest. Attention is to be directed towards God in a way that is more concentrated and more steady than on ordinary days. Keep the day holy by keeping the focus on the holy God. Thirdly, the holy rest day should be 1 out of every 7. Verse 9 says, 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but on the 7th day, it's a Sabbath to the Lord your God. Work 6, rest 1. Work 6, rest 1. That's the pattern described in the 10 Commandments. No, it doesn't say the Sabbath day has to be the last day of the week or the first day of the week or a Wednesday or a Sunday. The concept of weeks isn't even mentioned, but the command is simply work 6, rest 1. Every 7th day should be a Sabbath. We've also got to remember, no cheating is allowed. It says this, where does it say it? Back here. It says this, in it you shall not do any work, neither your son or your daughter, your manservant or your maidservant or your cattle, or the sojourner who is within your gates. So no cheating. You can't say, well, I'll keep it, but I'll put my maid to work, if you've got one, or my ox to thresh the carrot in front of its nose at 6 p.m., the evening of the Sabbath, or I'll make sure my assistant is working hard so I can take a decent rest, or I'll make sure my partner's doing work so that I can take a rest, or I'll go with golf with the lads, but my family at home, they're going to really struggle. It's not about that. Fifthly, we've got to remember that verse 11 leads to the basic point of the commandment. It's based on God's rest after creation. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. Which is meant to remind people of Genesis 2:2-3, where we see God, after creating everything, stepping back, resting on the 7th day, and it also says he blessed the 7th day and hallowed it. So both Genesis and Exodus tell us that God blessed and hallowed the rest day. And so what does it mean for God to bless a day? Well, in the Old Testament, when God blesses something, that thing becomes rich with blessing. God blesses people, they become rich with blessing. He blesses a land, and the land becomes rich with blessing. And so when he blesses a day, it becomes rich with blessings. And then what does it mean for it to be hallowed? Well, it means hallowed is the same word as sanctify, to make something holy. It's to set the day aside for a special focus on what is holy, namely God and his works. And so the two words together, almost like a cycle, as we experience God's blessing, we experience his holiness. And as we experience his holiness, we then in turn get his blessing. And the reason that we're given those things, in both Genesis and Exodus, why God blessed and hallowed the 7th day was not because God was tired, It's not because God was fed up and he needed a day off, but it means that he was satisfied with the work that he had done. He's not going to carry on tinkering and go, well, Alex's face a little bit mashed up. Maybe I'll go tinker around with there. Or maybe I'm not quite done with the platypus over here, so maybe let's put something else on there. He's finished. He's satisfied. He's saying, enough. I've done enough to stand back. And he even says it was very good. His rest means that he wanted to now stand back, as it were, in leisure and savor the beauty and completeness of his creative work. And this is the real basis of hallowing and blessing the day of rest. God is saying, in effect, let my highest creature, the one made in my image, stop every 7 days and commemorate with me the fact that I am creator who has done all this. Let him stop working for a day and focus on me, that I am the source of all that he has. That God is the fountain of blessing, that he is the one who made the very hands and minds from which we work. Let 1 day out of 7 demonstrate that all land and animals, all raw materials and all breath and strength and thought and emotion and everything comes from God. Let man look to God in leisure 1 day out of 7 for the blessing that is so elusive in the affairs of the world. The beautiful thing about Sabbath is that God instituted as a weekly reminder of 2 things. One is that all true blessing come from his grace, not our work. Everything God blesses comes from his grace, not our labor. And the other is that as we hallow him, as we honor him and keep the day holy, we will seek the fullness of blessing by giving our special attention to that day. But it'll be a mistake to conclude that the only reason why we rest and why we do Sabbath is because of the blessings of creation. Deuteronomy 5 gives us a second version of the 10 Commandments. And here's the basis of the Sabbath. The observance is slightly different. In verse 15 it says this: "You shall remember that you were a servant in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out thence with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day." In other words, the mighty hand and outstretched arm of God were not wearied by the work of creation. They're full of strength. God's rest was not for recuperation, but exaltation. And now the same God who has shown his power not just to create, he also shows it to save us. So the focus of Sabbath is not just saying creation is beautiful, but also we are a saved people. It says your God brought you up out of the land of Egypt, therefore he commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. 1 day of rest in every 7, kept holy to the Lord, reminds us and shows us the world that God is our creator and our deliverer. We did not make ourselves. We did not create ourselves. We cannot sustain ourselves or save ourselves without his grace. Be still and know that he is God. The Lord goes on and says at the exodus from Egypt, "Fear not, stand firm and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will work for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You only have to be still." This passage from Exodus 31 stresses again the truth that Sabbath signifies our utter reliance on God's grace. And the Lord says to Moses, "Say to the people of Israel, you shall keep my Sabbaths, for this is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that you may know that I, the Lord, sanctify you." The Sabbath is a sign. It points towards a truth that we're never to forget, the truth that God, and not we ourselves, has made us holy. That it's God who chooses us and sets us apart and works to make us distinct among the peoples of the earth. And so to tie that stuff together, Exodus 20, Deuteronomy 15, and Exodus 31 teach us that the Sabbath is a way of remembering and expressing the truth that God is our creator and deliverer and sanctifier. We are dependent on him for all that we have in the world, for our deliverance from enemies, and for our holiness. He's indeed designed that we work, but our work neither creates, it doesn't save, nor does it sanctify. For these things we have to depend on God. A friend of mine put it this way, that Sabbath is not about you going off to play golf with your mates as you leave your wife and kids behind, but it's working out a way that you can rest as a household and refocus on God. And when we come over to the New Testament, we find that in the intervening centuries, the rabbis have added a lot of stuff onto that initial command about Sabbath. Loads of other rules around that stuff. And so Jesus slams head on into these traditions with a very different view than the one shared by the Pharisees. And if we look very briefly at Matthew 12, 1-12, it says this. At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry, and they began to pluck ears of grain and to eat. When the Pharisees saw it, they said to him, "Look, your disciples are doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath." He said to them, "Have you not read what David did when he was hungry, and those who were with him? How he entered the house of God and ate the bread of the presence, which it was not lawful for him to eat, nor for those who were with him, but only for the priests? Or have you not read in the law how on the Sabbath the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are guiltless? I tell you, something great in the temple is here. And if you had known what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless, for the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath." And he went on from there and entered their synagogue, and behold, there was a man with a withered hand, and they asked him, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath?" So they might accuse him. He said to them, "What man of you, if he has one sheep and it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will not lay hold of it and lift it out? Of how much more value is a man than a sheep? So it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath." So again, what was wrong with the Pharisees? Why couldn't they see the Old Testament the way Jesus did? Why didn't they see David's eating the bread of the presence and the priest's Sabbath work in the temple as an indictment on their Sabbath traditions the way that Jesus did? Well, according to Jesus, the Pharisees could only condemn the innocent because they never understood what is said in Hosea 6:6. God says, "I desire mercy and not sacrifice." In other words, the whole law, the entirety of Torah, the entirety of the Old Testament is meant to exist for the sake of mercy. All the law, Jesus says at one point, is summed up in this one commandment. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. The Pharisees couldn't see the true meaning of the Sabbath because they didn't have hearts of love. The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath, Jesus says in Mark 2. And so if your heart isn't a heart for people, if it's not a heart of love, then you'll never see the true meaning of Sabbath. For the Sabbath is a gift of love to meet man's need, not an oppressive burden to make him feel miserable or proud. But even today, the Sabbath can be seen as a legal and heavy burden. In April of 1992, this is a true story, tenants let 3 apartments in an Orthodox neighborhood in Israel burn to the ground while they asked a rabbi whether a telephone call to the fire department on the Sabbath would violate Jewish law. And by the time the original fire spread to its 3rd house, the rabbi determined that yes, the phone call would have broken Sabbath law. That's not what Jesus came to do. He didn't come to abolish the Sabbath, but to dig it out from under a mountain of legalistic sediment and give it to us again as a blessing rather than a burden. It's a day for showing mercy and a day for doing good. It should not be governed rigidly or by narrow definition of what work is and what it's not, but it's a day to focus on the Lord. And now Jesus, we're told, is the Lord of the Sabbath. And so it's a day to focus on Jesus. And it is impossible for a day focused on Jesus that it should ever be a burden, because he is the one who said, "Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." So one way we apply this in the Rayment household is on Saturdays. We have no screen Saturdays at the Rayments. And this is not easy with 3 children. It's actually really, really very difficult. Because it means that I have to be a better father than I want to be on a Saturday. It means that I can't just entertain them with screens, but I have to get up at their time rather than my time. It means that I have to find fun things to do to engage with them when I could just throw them an iPad or something. It means that Laura and me, we're not allowed to even have our phones out because our kids, they slam us the minute they see any kind of screen near us too. But it does mean we listen to more music on vinyl because we're not putting a screen on to then put on Spotify. It means we play more board games as a family around the table. It means we take time over food and chat to each other more, which then means that God chat is way more natural than the forced, like on the daily, we must pray around dinner or whatever. It's just way more natural. But it's helped me as a human and as a father and as a husband just slow down. Remember that God sits on the throne and I'm not of value just because I'm busy. But there's some other fun Orthodox Jewish practices that I think we can apply that might help your Sabbath, whatever day of the week you choose. One is in Orthodox households, there is no technology being used. Even to the point where today in Orthodox communities, sometimes Gentiles, they're non-Jewish folk, can be paid to go and turn on the lights of a Jewish house and turn on the kettle and get the oven on for cooking and stuff. Like Gentiles get paid to do that in Jewish households. But maybe you try a day with no tech. One day a week, just stepping back and say, you know what, I'm not going to put a screen on. I'm not going to put a phone on. I can already see some of you sweating a bit. Another thing, and I think this could revolutionize the West if people did this, but in Orthodox Jewish households, they don't purchase a single thing on the Sabbath. But can you imagine just taking a break one day a week of no like Amazon scrolling, no going through Vinted or Depop, like no going on the random Instagram ads for, I got chimneas coming out of the, I've dug a hole in the ground that I can make a fire in. I don't need a chimney, but Instagram thinks I need one. But maybe you take a day where you're not going to purchase anything, no coffees, and you're just going to see that. And I bet you, a bit like the year of Jubilee, it'd be good for your finances, but also be interesting to do that whole waiting a whole day to see if you actually need the thing. A beautiful thing that happens in Orthodox Jewish households is they have a meal to both begin and end the Sabbath on a Friday night and a Saturday night. Maybe make one special meal a week where you're like, I'm going to take time over this and invite all people in my house, whether I'm a student living with other mates or whether I live in a house share, but I'm going to have a meal to begin and end the Sabbath. Take time over the food. This one's a bit controversial, but I love it. In Jewish communities, you can't travel more than a mile on the Sabbath. And the amount of people I chat to on a Sunday and ask them, how was your day yesterday? And they're like, well, I was seeing great Aunt Gwyneth 4 hours away, and we spent 8 hours of our Saturday in a car to see her for 2 hours at a burger stop between us and them, and all that stuff. And then, all the rows go on in the car, and they come back absolutely exhausted. I wonder if you could just take a break from that for a bit and say, you know what, I will see great Aunt Gwyneth, but when I've got time to travel before the day to spend time with them properly. But maybe try and limit your travel. One, it's good for the environment, but it's also good for your mental health, that you're not stuck in a car for most of your day off. Prayer is essential in Sabbath, and maybe just saying one day a week, I'm going to make sure that I've prayed with everyone in the household, one-on-one. Whether you live in a house share or you live with your mates or you've got a family at home. That you know what, this one day, I'm intentionally going to make sure that we just have 5 minutes just to pray with everyone in the house. And maybe the tech thing's too much, but maybe just one day a week, you could take a fast from social media. Maybe that'll be the day where you don't go on TikTok or Instagram or Facebook or whatever, but just one day a week. And especially those of you who work on social media, just take one day off and just say, you know what, I'm gonna rest from this for the day. And so what does this stuff about Sabbath have to do with healing? Do you remember the story started with healing? We chatted about that for a little bit. What does Sabbath have to do with healing? Why has John put these two things together? Why is it that this was the miracle that Jesus chose to do on the Sabbath multiple times rather than any other miracle? He wasn't feeding the 5,000 on the Sabbath. He wasn't doing some of those ones. Why was it healing and the Sabbath? Why did Jesus take those two things and put them together? And why did John then illuminate them and pick one of these as one of the signs about Jesus' divinity? Well, I think John is trying to tell us that ultimately the first step to any kind of healing is understanding that God is the God of Sabbath. That Sabbath is intended that we trust that God is enough, that He is on the throne, He is faithful, and as we invite Sabbath into our lives, and again, in a Jewish household, they literally on a Friday night will invite Sabbath into their home using imagery of like a queen coming into their home. And I love the idea of inviting Sabbath into your lives. But as we invite Sabbath into our lives, a proper day of rest, we recalibrate who is actually in control and who we put our trust in. And the reason breaking Sabbath was so punishable by Jewish law, by death, is because not taking a day of rest is the ultimate idolatry of the self. It's saying that you are more needed, more important, more trustworthy, more powerful than God Himself. And that He sets a model of life and you say, you know what, that model might work for others, but it doesn't work for me, thank you very much, God. The thing is, Alcoholics Anonymous get this. which started as a Christian discipleship tool. Step one is saying that we are powerless to change and our lives have become unmanageable. And whether it's the man at the pool of Bethesda, or you with your kids, or your family pressures, or your loneliness, or you're navigating dating, or the single life, or your job, or finances, or exams, most of us have come to a place where our lives feel unmanageable. And Jesus is the one who says, "Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." And so here is question tonight. Do you want to get well? Do you want to get well? Well, then take a break. Because God's remedy is his rest. God's remedy for you is inviting you into rest.